Want to turn your passion project into a profitable podcast? Meet Dineen, host of DNA Today and producer of 10 genetics-focused podcast shows. She's secured more than 70 sponsors and won multiple awards in the science and medicine podcast space. In this episode, Kira shares her experiences from high school podcaster to full-time entrepreneur, sharing insider tips on landing sponsorships and maximizing your podcast value. You won't want to miss key insights on how to craft irresistible media kits, build lucrative sponsorship packages, and avoid common pricing pitfalls. Welcome to the Podcasting Secrets Show, where successful creators share their best stories, secrets, and strategies. I'm your host, Nathan William. Hello, incurable creators. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Podcasting Secrets, where today I'm joined by Dineen. Kira is the host of the podcast DNA Today, and she has a slew of awards that she's won. She's secured more than 70 sponsors for her podcast. I know that's not an award, but that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. She's the winner of the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for 3 consecutive years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. She's earned a master's in science and genetics, which is the topic of her main show, DNA Today. And she's the producer and host of 10 different podcasts, most in the genetics and rare disease space. And today we're going to talk about sponsorships in podcasts, how to make money with a podcast using sponsorships. Thank you so much for joining us, Kira.
Thank you, Nathan. It's really great to be here. And everybody likes the topic of how to turn your podcast into a business. So hopefully it's a popular episode for you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to learning from you. So can you start off by just telling us a little bit more about yourself and your passions and your hobbies?
I became enthralled with podcasting. I was going on a family trip when I was all the way back in 8th grade. And it was a cross-country trip where I was, taking a long flight. I was like, how am I going to keep myself entertained for hours on this flight, right? I must be like 13 if I was in 8th grade. So being the nerd that I am in so many different facets of my life, I searched Harry Potter into the iTunes store, because that's back when it was called iTunes and not the Apple Store or the App Store. And this thing came up called MuggleCast. And it was a Harry Potter podcast. I'm like, oh, okay, it's probably a few minutes. I'll check it out, whatever. And then I see these audio files are like over an hour long. I'm like, what is this? And then, I turn it on and I don't know if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, but Hedwig's theme comes on like with an electric guitar. I'm not a singer, but so I was like, wow. And I learned that these podcasters were only about 5 years older than me. So they were in high school at the time when they started their show. And I was like, this is really cool. They just sit around and talk about this book series and fandom that they love. And they were really good at it. So once I got back home from this family trip, I was like, let me see if I can figure out how to do this for myself. So, a couple of years later, kind of managed to, was a little older, could figure it out better, and launched my first podcast in high school. And it's really just from listening to that first podcast episode and learning that those kids were just a little older than me. So I was like, well, maybe I can figure out how to do this. And it kind of set me on this path of going into podcasting. And I did not think that podcasting would be my main aspect of my career, but somehow that's become the case.
What does that look like, this career and this life that you've developed as a podcaster? Just kind of paint a picture for our listeners.
So when I started the show in high school, it was very much focused on, let me meet people in the field of genetics. This gives me an excuse to sit down and interview them, because originally I was reaching out to these researchers, doctors, genetic counselors, all these different types of roles in genetics and science. And as a high schooler, wanted to do informational interviews. Hey, what's your job like? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? How did you get to where you are? And not a lot of people were, carving time out of their day to talk to a high schooler. They were reserving that time for college age students. So that makes sense, And I was like, well, if I'm interviewing them for a show, maybe they'll take the meeting with me. So it was really started from a networking perspective. And just because I liked the technology, I saw that this was an area that was going to really expand. And, around this time, it was like 2011. That is really what, and it was DNA Today is what I started around that time, my main show now. And it's just been able to grow with my career. So I went to college, got a degree in genetics, and then kept the show going, turned into a radio show while I was there, and then got my master's in genetics, kept the show going during that time. And now I earned my master's about 4 years ago. And it's really since grad school for me, we have been able to develop relationships with a bunch of different companies, organizations, institutions in the genetic space that we've teamed up with and that they financially support the show. And so this has become a business for me, and as well as kind of spanning off into, as you mentioned, I do some other shows of consulting for people, being a producer for them. Oh, they need a guest host. They just need a host. They need someone to come up with the content and idea generation. So I kind of end up doing a lot that is spinning off from my main show, but it's been exciting to help develop those new shows. And I am really just excited by the twists and turns that my career has taken in podcasting, but still being able to involve that science aspect that I find really intriguing.
You originally wanted to get involved because you were fascinated with it, and you saw these older kids that were podcasting, and you thought that it might open some doors for you. And it sounds like it really did open those doors for you. And it's helped you develop financially lucrative relationships as a result of that. That's fascinating, because a lot of times that people do a podcast and they invite as their guests the people that they want to sell, the business leaders in their space, or the potential clients, or the influencers in their space. And they don't even care if they make any money off of the show itself. They're doing it for that relationship, or they end up making the money from those relationships from the show, and not even necessarily the podcast itself. You're giving value to those people by having them on your show. You're allowing them to promote whatever it is they care about. And then there's that law of reciprocity where they want to give back, and they get to know you and like you and trust you. Can you share with us an example of somebody that maybe you built a relationship with, and how that's turned out to be mutually beneficial for both of you?
So one of our sponsors is Johns Hopkins. The way that we both benefit from this relationship, what I bring to the table through DNA Today, the podcast, is that I've built up this following and this listenership for many years. I think in the fall we'll celebrate 12 years. And so from developing that, we've been able to really engage this listener base. And a lot of people that are listening are people that are relatively young in the field. So they may be prospective students, current students, recent graduates that are finding their way. When we're in that early career stage, there's often other courses that we want to take to kind of prepare us for that next level of our career. And Johns Hopkins provides this wonderful training course for people at that level. And so that's something that we ended up connecting on. And they're like, hey, you have our target demographic. Not only do you have people listening that are really interested in genetics, which is already a niche, right? You can have science shows, you can have biology shows. We're genetics. So we're very specific within that. And so they know anyone listening is going to be nerdy in that way and really involved with genetics and wanting to learn more. But not only that, we also skew that we're on the younger side of the career. Do we have people that are in older generations listening? Sure. But when you're looking at what the majority is, it tends to be those zillennials. So the kind of millennials, Gen Z, kind of that crossover. And so that's what we're bringing to the table. And obviously being able for us.
I've never heard that before.
Never heard that before. Yeah. Zillennial. I definitely didn't come up with it. But what's really nice is that we are bringing our leadership. We're very much established in the field of having this audience. And so Johns Hopkins can kind of say, oh, we would love to financially support the show and purchase these sponsorship packages so that we could let people know about these courses, and they could use a promo code. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with, you're listening to a show and they say for 50% off, use code whatever. And so they can also track, well, how many people actually signed up for a course that listened to that advertisement on our podcast or saw the advertisement on our social media or other areas, which we also include and work into these packages. So, and we also not only financially, but to benefit from that, to have an institution that is so recognized and world renowned like Johns Hopkins, that gives us even more credibility of like, wow, if that institution is supporting DNA Today, then should
Definitely.
others, and should we consider it? So it definitely is one that, happened out of networking. So much of what we've been able to accomplish in building up all these sponsors and engagement and higher profile people in genetics is going back to, I love networking. And that's how I started.
Okay, let's go back to a point you were talking about before. You got into genetics. For example, when I create a podcast logo for somebody, I take two symbols that are related to the benefit they provide or the target audience, and I merge those two things together. When you take two symbols that might be generic on their own that other people have used, but you put those two symbols together, you often can create something unique that nobody's ever done before. So you are a podcaster and you are a geneticist, and you have put those two things together in a way that's unique, that nobody else on the planet has really done what you're doing. And then the same way you're doing this. And I think that's one of the cool things about podcasting, where someone can bring their expertise and merge it with podcasting and do something very unique that adds value in a very unique way. Okay, so why genetics? Why does that resonate with you?
I always found it to be interesting how genetics is at the basis of so much. When we think about our health, so much goes back to, well, what are we genetically predisposed to? There's so much within genetics that we still don't understand. And I find that really invigorating to be like, there's so much left to learn. I remember sitting in a high school biology class as a sophomore. There was this concept called junk DNA, where, most of our genetic code is actually just junk. It doesn't do anything. And I was just sitting there and I was like, there is no way that most of our genetic code is just, it's leftover, it's garbage. I was like, that just seems wrong. I mean, did I have anything to back that up? No, but just having those thoughts. And, now it's been 15 years or something since then. And we don't call it junk DNA anymore. We realize that it does a lot of behind the scenes work compared to other parts of our genes that are very actively working. So just one example of how much can change. And I think it's just so exciting that we are at a point right now in genetics where things are moving so fast and we are coming up with so many better and more efficient treatments. We now have the first FDA approved treatment for a genetic condition using this genetic editing technology called CRISPR. And that condition is sickle cell that it essentially cures. And I was able to talk to the first person in the world that was pretty much cured from sickle cell with this treatment. Her name's Victoria Gray. And it's just amazing that I learned about this thing called CRISPR that can edit your genes. And 12 years after starting the show, now I'm interviewing the first person in the world that was cured from this. And it's just remarkable at how fast genetics moves. It's never boring. There's always something new to talk about. And that's how I can have a weekly show about genetics, because you can't have a weekly show about a lot of areas because it's not quite enough information to dive into or enough newness. But it's just, I think, going to be a very exciting career that I'm relatively young. I am still barely in my 20s. So I hope for decades to come, I'm just going to be able to really witness and observe so much changing and how that's reflecting back on our health and how much we can control and prevent and treat.
I love how the medium of podcasting has given you a voice. That's a huge reason why a lot of people get into podcasting. You don't just get in to have a podcast, but you get in to talk about and share and something that you're crazy passionate about, like you are with genetics. Talk to us about some of these other podcasts that you've run really quick. What are some of the most successful podcasts that you've run besides the DNA Today show?
Yeah, so I've done a few over the years. Most of them have been in the science space, as you mentioned at the top, Nathan. And I've also kind of expanded out into areas that I'm not as familiar with. Recently started a new show about entrepreneurship and just kind of what I've learned a lot from in the podcasting space as an entrepreneur. That's called Midnight Market. And another show that was launched this year is from the Journal of Genetic Counseling, their official podcast. I was very flattered that they reached out to me to be like, hey, can you help us launch this new podcast? And that's called DNA Dialogues. Love the name of that. I don't remember who came up with it, if it was myself or one of my team members there. But it's just so exciting to work with people and develop their podcast and go from having a conversation about, okay, well, what could it be, to launch day. And you're like, wow, it's out there. We created the trailer. We produced that intro. We selected that theme music. We figured out really good guests to start it with. It's really fun to be able to have, sometimes a small, sometimes a big role, depending on the client and what they need, to be able to do that and bring my 12, 13 years of experience into that and knowing, hey, I failed a bunch. Why don't you take the detour and you can go a little bit faster and learn from my mistakes without having to experience them yourself. So I think that's been a big part. And especially the shows that are within this science medicine space, it also can be helpful if I'm bringing in that expertise as well. So I think it's just been a really cool experience to build it up, especially when clients are interested in, like, we want sponsors. Sometimes it's the company is just paying for it and it's part of their marketing budget. And they're like, we want to do this and provide education. And especially when there's big updates in the company or organization. But it's been really cool to be able to do it and have it. All the shows are so different in the way that their approach is, how the interviews are done, like what that mission is a little bit different for every show, even if they're in a similar area of rare disease or genetics.
I love that you were willing to help, that you are willing to help shows that other people might consider competitive, right? You think in the traditional business world, historically, you saw another company as a competitor and you'd work to beat them and destroy them. I love it when you see people that are willing to help these podcasts in the same space. And you look at podcasters that are succeeding the best, most of them are on a whole bunch of other shows and they're on these related shows and they have people from those related shows on their shows, and that cross promotion, the synergies that can happen between those is one of the best growth strategies out there. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of collaboration versus competition in this space?
I like the way that you phrase that in terms of it is collaboration and that nobody listens to just one podcast, right? If they're interested in a certain area, they're probably going to check out multiple shows in that area. That might be different business ventures where you really choose one and you stick with it. But podcasting, it's great because when you go to launch a show or a new series, or you're just trying to grow, as we all are, being able to collaborate with other podcasters. And we've done this. Whenever I'm involved with a new show, I'm like, hey, why don't we drop the pilot episode? If it's relevant, right? Why don't we drop the pilot episode of this new show in this space on DNA Today, my main show, because that's going to get an automatic, few thousand downloads. So that's great because then all these people hear it. And if they enjoy that first episode at the end, we're like, hey, thanks for listening to this in the DNA Today feed. Be sure to check out, say, Rare Insights is a podcast that launched in June 2024 that I'm an executive producer there. And so saying, hey, this is, if you've enjoyed this show, go make sure you search Rare Insights in whatever podcast app you're listening to and go check out the other episodes that we have. And it's such a great way to sometimes in a free way, if you're doing a swap from one episode to another podcast, saying, hey, let's swap episodes. You play mine, I'll play yours. And then we can share an audience. And I think that's so key. And why also being a guest on other episodes is really helpful, because if people connect with you and they're learning from you and they just kind of like how you're coming across, they're likely to check out your shows, because people don't just listen just for the topic. If they like someone, they'll go check it out. And if they're like, I like that person's vibe, or I really like what they're bringing to the table, I like the insight that they're sharing, then they're likely to go check it out. And I think doing cross advertising is great too, where you're like, let's both share advertisements with each other. We'll both share a 30 or 60-second ad spot on each other's shows. But I think even better is when you can guest on each other's shows, because then you're kind of giving the listeners a taste of what your show is like.
Yeah, definitely. Being on the show is far better than getting an ad on the show. I completely agree. Today, you wanted to talk about sponsorships. Can you tell us your story of how you got into sponsorships, maybe how you sold your first sponsorship, maybe some mistakes that you made and what you learned in the sponsorship world?
Sure. So I had DNA Today, my main show, for about 7 years before I made any money from it, because it really did start, as we were saying at the beginning, of I wanted to meet people in the field of genetics and network. That was my main objective out of the show, and to also keep myself accountable for learning different things. If I have a show, then I got to be putting out new episodes, new lessons about genetics. And so it started very much, I would still consider all of that a passion project. This is something that I was just interested in. I wasn't seeking out sponsorship because at the beginning I was like, I don't know. I mean, who's going to take a high schooler seriously, a college kid seriously in terms of, oh, we're going to pay you to do advertising on your show. But as I graduated from college, I was like, all right, I got a little more credibility. Now I've got, some letters after my name. I passed the certification exam for being a cytogenetic technologist. So basically you sit in a lab and you look at chromosomes all day. And so I was able to get that and was like, all right, I have a little bit more under my belt. I was like, well, maybe once I get my master's, I'll start reaching out and seeing if I can get sponsorship. Because at that point, I was still keeping the show going. I actually had a company reach out to me first to be like, how much is it to advertise in your show? And I go, I'm reading this email and I'm like, I don't know. Like, how much do I charge? Right? This was 2018, I think. And so whenever I start doing a little Googling, well, how much should I charge them? Well, maybe I'll just make it like a flat $100 and say, this is what I'll do. And my thing was, when I received that email, I didn't want to be like, well, you're my first sponsor, so how much can you afford? Fake it till you make it. I was like, okay, great. These are our rates. This is what you'll get out of this. I'll write the advertisement script. You can approve it and edit it. I'm just making it up as I go. And it turned out great. I did charge them $100 for that first ad spot. And I think it was probably a couple ads throughout, like maybe an episode or two. And I think it was episode number 101. So I had done over 100 episodes, nothing paid. I was, spending my own money on things like hosting and microphones and all of that. But it just kind of fell into my lap. And then from there, once you get the, I would say, second, third sponsor, then it starts rolling. I think the first few are really challenging to figure out, and pricing can be so different. And that is a hard area to figure out. Well, how much do I charge? And that's something that, we look at every 6 months. Okay, do we think that this is fair pricing? Is this what we're worth? But it's definitely, for me, it was a long game, and it wasn't my objective at the beginning. And I think a lot of great podcasts start as passion projects and can then adapt. If you're going into podcasting with the sole reason, I want to make money from this, there are probably easier ways to make money. But listeners will really appreciate having a show that you're just really bringing your all and you're really enthusiastic about it. And if you happen to make money and you can shift into having that be a business model, fantastic.
Are you a full-time podcaster now, or do you have another job?
So my main gig is podcasting. So between DNA Today and the other shows that I produce, sometimes guest host, that is a full income for me. I also do, to keep my foot in the genetics world, I still see patients twice a week, telehealth, so that I can keep up those skills. And it helps me as a host on these shows, because issues that I face with patients, I am then aware of and talking about and interviewing people with. So I'm at a point where I'm like, I don't know how long I will be in clinic, but knowing that right now it's a really great fit to be in both worlds and to have that flexibility that I can say, okay, let me just do it twice a week. I think once a week would be too little in terms of keeping up with the patient load that I have at the private practice I work at. But it's helpful. And I think it's also, as an entrepreneur, great to phase into that if you can, money-wise, so that you're not one day, no paycheck is coming in. Because as a podcaster, if you're funded by sponsorship, you can make a lot of money and then no money for quite a bit. So you kind of have to be very prepared financially for having those ebbs and flows.
How long have you been podcasting now?
So I started podcasting in 2011, so 13 years. The first show I had was a different show from DNA Today. I kind of figured out podcasting with it and then started the main show. Yeah, so 13 years.
So you went 13 years. Your first sponsorship came at episode 101 of the show. How long had you been doing it at that point? But by the time you got to episode 101?
7 years. So we weren't quite doing, the release schedule differed over the years. Yeah.
How many episodes and how many years after that was it before you were making enough money that you could go full-time podcasting and didn't have to work another job?
I would say probably 3 years after that, 2 or 3 years, depending on what you see as a livable wage, I suppose. I would have been able to sustain myself and live comfortably with that income. For reference, I'm not married. I don't have children yet, all of that. So you have to keep that in mind too. Being a single person, life is a little bit cheaper than maybe if you already have a family and everything.
Can you take us through the steps, how you would teach somebody how to get a sponsor and then effectively manage that sponsor relationship?
Yeah, getting into the nitty gritty, like how do you go from 0 sponsors to booking your first sponsor? And I think one of the main aspects of this that we've mentioned a couple times now is that having your show have a focus, having a niche, because it's so much easier to say, hey, we've built this audience that's really interested in this one area, and then going to companies and pitching yourself and saying, hey, your target audience are these people. That's exactly who's listening to my show. So I've already captured exactly who you're trying to reach. So it becomes a very personal sell at that point for those ad spots or however your sponsorship packages are looking. And it's just going to make you look it's a very advantageous opportunity for them to team up with you. Because also, if people have been listening for a little while, they've gotten to know you as a host. So if this is a show where you're interviewing people or you're very high production, you have all these different types of interviews like NPR and you're kind of weaving them together. If your voice is on it and your personality is coming through, then people will latch on to that. We have these things called parasocial relationships where I feel like I really know Taylor Swift. She does not know I exist, but I've been a fan of her since 2007. I've really followed her career and I feel like we're friends. Like I feel like I know she's playing this show. Travis is on stage with her. That is a parasocial relationship. You can have that with podcasters where when my favorite podcasters recommend, oh, I was at Trader Joe's, I checked out this new coffee. Oh my gosh, it's so good. You bet you when I go to Trader Joe's, I'm going to pick up that coffee and check it out because I have kind of know this host at this point. Just like if your best friend recommends it to you, you're way more likely to check it out than any other type of advertising coming at you. And businesses are picking up on this. So being able to be an established podcast that has a very niche audience and developing your media kit to be like, hey, I'm not just sending an email with some information. Where using a program like Canva has free levels to it where you can design basically like a pitch deck. Some people do that. I think media kits are a little bit better where you have that, classic, 8x11 size, if you were to print it out. But basically going over what is your show about? Do you have any awards or accolades? Who have been guests on your show? What's a little information about you? How often do you release? What are those numbers looking like? And as I've been mentioning, packages. Hey, if you buy our basic package, it includes this many advertisements or this many impressions on an advertisement, maybe a featured interview on the show, a feature in a newsletter you have, social media, including a giveaway. So there's so many other things that you can also build up with these packages to say, hey, I'm not just selling you one little ad. I'm going to put this all together because then you can also put a higher price tag on it because you're like, we're giving you a 360 marketing package. And I think taking those steps, I would be surprised if you don't end up booking sponsors pretty soon.
I love that. I love how you can bundle with a podcast. You can put a blog with it. You can put a video with it. You do social posts with it. Lots of different value that you can give. Instead of just selling a commodity, you're putting together something that's uniquely yours. What are some of the biggest mistakes that people make in the podcast sponsorship space? How do we avoid them?
Yeah, mistakes. So I think about not charging enough. So there's this concept in podcasting called CPM, cost per milli or cost per thousand. So it's like, say, I think right now, maybe it's like $20, $25. If 1,000 people hear that advertisement, you make about $20, $25. But if you have that niche space, and if it's something where the people advertising are trying to reach those specific people, I don't think that standard CPM is relevant because you're whittling down exactly who they're trying to reach. Whereas if they go for a very general show that's like a news program or something where anybody is listening, anybody's interested, only a small percentage of the audience is even relevant to them, but they're paying for so many more people to hear it. You're cutting all of that out. So I think charging more, you're probably undercharging, in my opinion, if you have that kind of show and that kind of setup and engagement with your listeners. So I think just not charging enough and not going out there and pitching yourself. I mean, what's the worst? You don't hear back. You're moved on already. So I think, just going for it and going to a lot of different experiences where you can be networking, going to these podcast conferences or whatever conference is in your area of expertise or the focus of your show, that's really great to be developing these relationships. When I go to genetic conferences, I'm spending the majority of my time in the exhibit hall pitching every single booth because these are all people advertising to genetics people. That's what I can do for them. And so being able to do that, and now a lot of times I'm checking in with people because they're already sponsors, but being able to provide all of that and making sure that you're not underselling yourself. I think I see this so much even with entrepreneurs and speakers and all of these different areas where people are like, oh, well, this is good enough kind of thing. It's like, no, shoot for higher.
What other advice would you have for people that are trying to pursue sponsorship or even make more money from sponsorships?
Yeah, I would say really build up what you can offer them. So we all know of these advertisement script, 30, 60 seconds, but wouldn't it be even better, or adding on to the list, to have them come on your show for a full episode interview where you talk about a topic in this field of yours, and then kind of providing some insight from this company, from this spokesperson from the company of how they are contributing to the solution of a problem, or them just providing a lot of their leadership in this area and expertise so that people are like, when they think of this topic, they think of this company and how they're really understanding what's happening. So I think thinking of how else can you build this up? The most recent thing we've done is building up our email list. So we now have, I think, about 6,000 or 7,000 people subscribed to our email marketing list, and we don't spam them. We send one email a month of like, hey, here's what's new. And we have a section where we include information about recent sponsors. And that's really great because that's another thing that we can offer for companies to be like, oh, if you would like this, that's a bigger package to have that included. And it's also a good way of reminding people you exist, simply. Once we send out an email, I get people constantly emailing back, hey, I've been meaning to reach out. We got to book that episode. I want that next sponsorship package. So just staying active is really great. And email marketing is relatively easy. If you're drafting one email a month and sending it out, other people would say you should do it more often, but I think that's what works for us. But it's such a great way to have a direct contact to your audience because so much of what we build on social media, that can be gone. And TikTok, we've seen in the US, is that going to stick around? What's going to happen with that? If all of my content was on TikTok, I would be really worried. But having a podcast, you own that RSS feed. It's just the players that you submit it to for people to listen through. Your email marketing list, you own that list. That's yours. So investing in areas where you're not suddenly going to lose it because some company gets sold to another, or all of a sudden it's not cool anymore to be on a certain platform. I think all of that is important to build up what you can offer for sponsors. And then you're more attractive in that sense. And they're going to pay more when you start offering many aspects of a package. Because when I was offering just advertisements alone, it was so much work just to get $100. And now it's like, oh, well, you have to buy packages. You can't just buy a one-off advertisement. So it's more efficient. And that's when we started making what I would say is money to be like, oh, I could live off the income now. Whereas before I was like, oh, this is a nice little secondary source of money.
Kira, thank you so much for sharing so much value with our audience today. If our audience has enjoyed this episode like I have, and they want to learn more about you and your products and services, what are the best ways for them to do it?
Sure. So, I mean, if you're someone that wants a little bit of help doing all of this or aspects of podcasting, as I mentioned, I love helping people launch their shows, grow their shows, monetize, all of these different areas. I've done every aspect of podcasting, and it's really fun when I get to dive into a new project. So you guys can feel free to, you could just Google me. My name is Kira Dineen, KiraDineen. You can email me directly at info@dnatoday.com. but I am pretty Googleable. I think I'm the only Kira Dineen active online. So that thank you to my parents for giving me a name that was unique, because career-wise, I think that's worked out so far. But thank you so much, Nathan. This was really fun, and I hope people learned a thing or two about sponsorship.
Thank you so much, Kira. Here are my key takeaways from this episode. Number one, Kira Dineen started podcasting in high school after being inspired by a Harry Potter podcast. Number two, her main show, DNA Today, began as a networking tool to connect with professionals in the genetics field. Number three, Kira developed her podcast into a business by securing sponsorships and building relationships with companies in the genetics space. Number four, she emphasized the importance of having a niche audience for attracting sponsors. Number five, Kira's first sponsorship came after 7 years and 101 episodes, with her initial rate being $100 for an ad spot. Number six, she recommends creating comprehensive sponsorship packages that include various marketing elements beyond just podcast ads. Number seven, collaboration with other podcasters rather than viewing them as competition is crucial for growth in the podcasting industry. Number eight, Kira advises against underpricing sponsorships, especially for niche podcasts that offer targeted audiences. Number nine, building an email list is valuable for maintaining direct contact with your audience and offering additional value to sponsors. And finally, number 10, Kira suggests that passion projects often make the best podcasts, as genuine enthusiasm resonates with listeners and can eventually lead to financial success. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I wish you success in your podcasting sponsorships. And if you're looking for a great podcasting platform to help you create, grow, and monetize your venture around a podcast with 35 integrated modules, I recommend you check out PodUp and get a free trial at podup.com.